Hearing my own cousin plot to rob me of millions, thinking I was just a clueless old fool, was a shock, but I didn't panic. I used my brain to turn his greed into his own ruin. I'm Samuel Miller, a 74-year-old retired geography teacher from Cisco, Texas. Before I tell you how I destroyed them, please subscribe. Also, tell me in the comments what country are you listening from, and what would you do in my shoes? Story begins. Cisco, Texas, has a way of settling into your bones if you stay here long enough. It's a town built on hard red dirt, sun-bleached mesquite, and the faint, ghostly memories of old oil booms that dried up before the interstate was even paved. People out here don't talk much unless they have something worth saying. And at 74 years old, I've found that listening is far more profitable than speaking anyway. For 40 long, rewarding years, I sat in a humid classroom at Cisco High School, teaching the wild sons and daughters of oilfield workers and cattle ranchers about the earth beneath their boots. I taught them about tectonic plates, sedimentary layers, and how the ground we walk on is never just one thing. It's a history book written in stone. If you know how to read the pages, most folks look at a piece of land and only see what's on top. They see withered winter wheat, a dried-up creek bed, or a herd of skinny black Angus cattle searching for shade under a live oak. But a geologist or an old geography teacher like me looks deeper. We look at the strata. We look at what's hidden beneath the surface, buried under millions of years of pressure and time. And if there's one thing the earth has taught me, it's that the surface can be incredibly deceiving. It can look dead, barren, and utterly worthless, while holding a kingdom of wealth just a few thousand feet down. The Miller Ranch is 640 acres of what the locals call starvation land. It sits on the edge of Eastland County, a square mile of stubborn caliche clay, prickly pear cactus, and rock outcroppings that will break a tractor axle if you aren't paying attention. My grandfather acquired it back in the early 1900s, cleared it with nothing but a team of mules and a spine made of iron, and passed it down through the generations. When the Great Depression hit, the Millers didn't leave. When the droughts of the 1950s turned the topsoil into choking dust, we stayed. My late wife, Martha, and I spent 30 years on the front porch of that old homestead, watching the West Texas sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. When she passed away a decade ago, the ranch became my monastery. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It didn't owe a dime to any bank, and it didn't ask anything of me other than to let it exist in its own rugged splendor. I never cared about turning it into a massive commercial enterprise. I had my teacher's pension, a small garden behind the house that grew the sweetest jalapenos in the county, and a library full of vintage geological surveys. I was content. But 6 months ago, the quiet rhythm of my life was shattered by the arrival of family. Or rather, what I thought was family. Thomas was my second cousin, a 42-year-old man with a silver tongue, an expensive pair of ostrich skin boots he couldn't afford, and a history of failed business ventures that stretched from Fort Worth to El Paso. He was the kind of man who always looked like he was running away from a ghost or chasing a mirage. When he showed up on my porch on a blistering November afternoon, sweating through a starched Western shirt and carrying a bottle of mid-shelf bourbon, my instincts told me to lock the screen door. But old age has a way of softening a man's edges. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands, and I remembered him as a little boy running around the family reunions in Abilene. "Uncle Sam," he had said, his voice dripping with a carefully rehearsed humility. "I'm drowning out there in the city. The real estate market is cutthroat, and the banks are breathing down my neck. Let me come out here and run the ranch for you. You shouldn't be fixing fences and hauling hay at your age anyway. Let me do the heavy lifting, lease some cattle, and get this place back on its feet. We're family. We gotta stick together." Against my better judgment, I nodded. I didn't need the money from cattle, but I figured giving a desperate young man a purpose was a good deed to anchor my twilight years. I signed a basic management agreement, giving him the authority to oversee the day-to-day operations of the land, while I maintained total ownership. It didn't take long for the script to change. Within 3 months, Thomas stopped talking about family legacy and started talking exclusively about ruin. Every single evening, he would walk into my kitchen, pull out a chair with an aggressive scrape against the linoleum, and toss a grease-stained ledger onto the table. "It's a money pit, Sam," he would groan, rubbing his temples as if carrying the weight of the world. "The soil is completely dead. I tried testing the soil chemistry in the north pasture, and the nitrogen levels are non-existent. The grass is coming up sparse, and the cattle are losing weight. On top of that, the main well is pumping brackish water. If we don't drill a new one, which will cost us $30,000 minimum, the herd is going to dehydrate. We're bleeding cash. Sam, I'm maxing out my own credit cards just to buy feed." I would sit there, sipping my black coffee, watching him closely. Over 40 years of teaching high schoolers teaches you how to spot a liar. You don't look at their eyes. Liars can practice eye contact until they're blue in the face. You look at their micro-movements. I noticed how Thomas's eyes darted toward my antique desk where the property deed was kept. I noticed how his complaints were always perfectly timed right after I received my monthly pension check. A real cattleman loves the land even when it's cruel. Thomas spoke about the Miller Ranch with a toxic, burning resentment, yet he refused to leave. He stayed, enduring the ruin, constantly hammering away at my resolve, trying to convince me that I was a burden to him, and that the land was a curse to us both. "Maybe it's time to let it go," he suggested one night, his voice dropping into a soft, predatory purr. "I know a guy in Dallas who buys up degraded properties for tax write-offs. He won't pay much, maybe $20,000 just to take it off our hands, but it'll clear the debts and save you from the county property tax assessments next year. You've done your time, Sam. You deserve to live in a nice, air-conditioned condo in Austin, not out here sweating in the dust." I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I just told him I'd pray on it. In reality, I was analyzing him like a strange geographical anomaly. Why was a man so desperate to buy a piece of land he claimed was entirely worthless? The math didn't add up, and in the world of geology, the math never lies. The answer came on a suffocatingly humid Thursday night in mid-May. The West Texas air was thick, charged with static electricity from an approaching storm system moving in from the Gulf. The sky was an ominous, bruised shade of indigo, and the distant horizon flickered with silent heat lightning. Thomas had driven out to the property late, around 9 o'clock, claiming he needed to check a faulty latch on the old tractor shed near the eastern boundary. I couldn't sleep. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, making my old joints ache, and a strange, persistent uneasiness hung in the back of my mind. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to walk out to the tool shed near the barn to find an old brass oil lantern. I've always preferred the steady, warm glow of kerosene over the harsh beam of a flashlight when a storm is coming. I didn't turn on the porch lights, and I didn't carry a flash. When you've lived on a piece of land for decades, your feet remember the path better than your eyes ever could. I walked barefoot across the cool grass, my movements silent against the soft earth. As I rounded the corner of the hay barn, I noticed Thomas's white Ford F-150 parked near the tractor shed. The headlights were turned off, but the exhaust was emitting a faint, pale plume of smoke into the humid air. The engine was idling with a low, vibrating growl. The tractor shed itself was dark, except for a single, razor-thin sliver of golden light slicing through the gap in the warped wooden doors. I stopped. The wind had died down completely, creating that eerie, breathless silence that always precedes a Texas tornado. In that absolute stillness, a sound drifted through the wooden slats of the shed. It was a laugh. It wasn't the stressed, exhausted chuckle Thomas used when he was complaining about the ranch's finances. It was a loud, arrogant, chest-deep laugh of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. "Yeah, I'm looking right at the map now." Thomas's voice echoed clearly through the gaps in the pine boards. He was pacing inside, his heavy boots clomping rhythmically against the dirt floor. I stepped closer, pressing my back against the rough, weathered exterior wall of the shed, blending into the shadows of a massive live oak tree. My breath was shallow, my heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. "The old man is completely oblivious," Thomas said into his cell phone, his tone dripping with a terrifying mixture of condescension and greed. He spends all day staring at his old maps and reading textbooks from the 1970s. He has no idea what's actually happening out here. I've got him completely convinced that the soil is toxic and that he's ruining my life by keeping the place. He looked so defeated today. I honestly thought he was going to hand me the deed right then and there. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, but I didn't move a muscle. I listened. Listen to me. Corporate called me back an hour ago. Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a sharp, intense whisper. The deep-core seismic data from Vanguard Energy is confirmed. The Barnett Shale Formation under this exact section of the county is at its absolute thickest right beneath our north pasture. It's not just a small pocket. Man, it's a massive, high-pressure natural gas reservoir. The geologists estimate the extraction value in the tens of millions. Vanguard's acquisition team already drafted the paperwork. They're offering a $25 million lump sum payment for the total mineral rights, plus an 8% monthly royalty on production. Inside the shed, I heard the distinctive, metallic click of an aluminum beer can being opened, followed by a long, satisfied swallow. But the VP made it clear. Thomas chuckled darkly. They won't execute a multi-million-dollar lease with a retired schoolteacher who might get sentimental or hire a fancy lawyer to negotiate a higher percentage. They want a clean, corporate-friendly transfer. That's why I'm closing the deal with Sam this weekend. I'm going to hand him $20,000 in cash. Tell him it's a favor to clear his debts and have him sign a standard general warranty deed transferring the property to my LLC. The old fool trusts me blindly. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him just to save my finances. The second that deed is recorded at the county courthouse, Vanguard cuts the $25 million check directly to me. I'll dissolve the LLC, wire the funds to an offshore account, and leave this miserable dust bowl behind forever. Let the old man figure out what happened when the drilling rigs show up. The silence that followed inside the shed was deafening. The words hung in the humid Texas night like a poison gas. Thick and suffocating. I stood there in the absolute darkness, the rough wood of the shed pressing against my back, my own flesh and blood, a boy I had fed at my own table, a man I had tried to save from his own failures, was standing 10 feet away from me, plotting to strip me of my heritage, my home, and my dignity, leaving me penniless and humiliated in my old age. In a movie, that's the moment where the protagonist bursts through the door, swinging a fist, or shouting curses, demanding confrontation. But life in the classroom teaches you something different. When a student is cheating on an exam, you don't scream at them the moment they pull out the cheat sheet. You wait. You let them complete the test. You let them write their name at the top. And then, right when they think they've gotten away with it, you hand them the red pen. I didn't panic. I didn't rage. Instead, a wave of profound, icy clarity washed over me. Colder than the northern wind that blows through the Texas panhandle in January. Every single puzzle piece clicked into place. The late-night truck tracks weren't poachers. They were Vanguard Energy surveyors. The brackish water report wasn't a natural disaster. It was a falsified document meant to break my spirit. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. My heart rate hadn't even elevated. Thomas thought he was playing chess against a fragile, senile opponent. He forgot that before I was an old man on a porch, I spent 40 years analyzing the hidden fractures, the fault lines, and the immense, destructive forces that move silently beneath the earth. He thought he was the predator. He had no idea he had just stepped onto a fault line, and I was about to trigger an earthquake. Slowly, deliberately, I turned away from the shed. I walked back along the gravel path, my feet navigating the stones with practiced ease. As I reached the porch, the first jagged bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the Miller Ranch in a stark Talvin, blinding white light, followed by the deep, rolling boom of thunder. The storm was finally here, and as I unlocked my front door and stepped inside the quiet house, I smiled into the dark. The morning after a West Texas thunderstorm is unlike anything else in the world. The rain doesn't gently soak into the caliche clay. It battles it. By 6 o'clock, the storm clouds had rolled east toward Dallas, leaving behind a sky so crisp and blue, it looked like shattered glass. The air was thick, heavy with the sharp, medicinal scent of wet cedar and petrichor. The unique, earthy smell of dry soil finally getting a drink. I sat at my kitchen table, wrapped in the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My hands were wrapped around a faded porcelain mug of black coffee. It was hot, bitter, and exactly what I needed to anchor my mind. I hadn't slept a wink. When you find out that your own blood is planning to rob you blind and leave you to rot in a retirement home, sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. Instead of pacing or weeping, I had spent the small hours of the night thinking. I thought about the earth. I thought about how a fault line forms silently over decades, under immense pressure, until a single, tiny shift causes the whole mountain to collapse. Thomas thought he was the pressure. He didn't realize he was the one standing on the unstable ground. Around 7, the screen door rattled, and the rusted springs groaned as it was thrown open. Thomas walked in. He looked like hell. His eyes were bloodshot. His starched shirt from the night before was wrinkled, and he carried the unmistakable sewer odor of stale Miller Lite and cheap cologne. He was trying to look like a man carrying the weight of a failing ranch. But to me, knowing what I knew, he just looked like a thief who hadn't slept because his pockets were still empty. "Morning, Sam," he muttered, dropping heavily into the chair across from me. The linoleum floor protested under his weight. He didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he reached for the coffee pot, pouring himself a mug with a shaky hand. God, that storm was brutal. I was up half the night checking the perimeter fences. The wind ripped down a whole section near the creek. More money down the drain. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the way his fingers twitched against the ceramic mug. "Is that so?" I said, my voice steady, smooth as river stone. "Must have been hard work in the dark." "You have no idea," he sighed, rubbing his face with his palms. "It's just one thing after another out here, Sam. It's like this land is cursed. It wants to break us." He reached down and lifted a battered manila folder from his leather briefcase, tossing it onto the table between us. It landed with a dull thud, right next to my coffee mug. "I got the official reports back from the agricultural testing lab in Abilene," Thomas said, leaning forward, his voice shifting into that low, urgent tone he used when he was trying to sell a lie. "It's worse than I thought, Sam. The core samples show severe salinity in the lower soil strata. The water table under the north pasture is contaminated with heavy alkaline minerals. It's poison, Sam. It's killing the root systems of the coastal Bermuda grass. That's why the cattle are failing. If we keep trying to run cows on this dirt, the county's going to cite us for animal neglect by the end of the summer." I didn't reach for the folder right away. I just looked at it. I knew the Agricultural Extension Office in Abilene. The director, Bobby Vance, had been one of my students back in 1985. Bobby's reports were always printed on heavy, cream-colored watermarked paper, with the state seal at the top. The papers peeking out of Thomas's folder were standard, bright white copy paper, the kind you buy in bulk at Staples. "Salinity," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's a shame. My grandfather grew cotton on that north pasture during the Dust Bowl. Never had a problem with salt. Well, times change, Sam." "The geology shifts," Thomas said quickly, his micro-movements betraying his panic. He tapped the folder with a blunt index finger. "The data doesn't lie. Look at the numbers. We're sitting on 600 acres of toxic dust. The bank called me again this morning about the equipment lease. If we don't liquidate something fast, they're going to come out here with a flatbed and repossess the John Deere. I'm telling you, Uncle Sam, we're at the end of the rope." He slid a second piece of paper across the table. This one was a single sheet, neatly typed. I recognized the layout immediately. It was a standard general warranty deed, pre-formatted for Eastland County. All it needed was my signature, a notary stamp, and $20,000 of his LLC's money to strip the Miller name off the land forever. "I talked to my investor friend in Dallas again last night," Thomas whispered, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger he couldn't quite mask. "He's willing to take the hit. 20,000 cash. Today, it wipes out the equipment debt, pays off the back taxes, and leaves you with enough to put a down payment on that luxury senior living center in Austin, the one with the golf course views. You won't have to worry about a single broken fence ever again." I looked down at the deed. It was written in cold, sterile legalese. Grantor does hereby grant, sell and convey unto the grantee. I could feel Thomas's breath on me, metaphorical and suffocating. He was leaning so far across the table, I could see the sweat beads forming along his hairline. He thought he was delivering the final blow to a tired, broken old man. He thought I was going to reach for my spectacles, sigh, and sign my life away. Instead, I looked up at him and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the patient, knowing smile I used to give to high school freshmen who thought they could slide a plagiarized essay past my desk. $20,000. I mused softly. That's a lot of money for a piece of toxic dust. Tom, your friend must be a very charitable man. Thomas blinked, his confidence stuttering for a fraction of a second. He uses these properties for corporate tax write-offs. Sam, it's a billionaire thing. You and I wouldn't understand the tax codes. But it's a blessing for us. A literal godsend. I see, I said, leaning back in my chair, letting my joints crack slightly to play up the illusion of fragility. Well, a square mile of land is a heavy thing to let go of. Tom, your Aunt Martha's ashes are scattered under the live oak by the old cistern. I can't just sign it away over morning coffee. I need to walk the dirt one last time. I need to feel it under my boots. Say my goodbyes. Thomas's jaw tightened. I could see the irritation flitting across his features, the impatience of a man who had a multi-million-dollar contract waiting on a deadline. Sam, we don't have time for a walk down memory lane. The bank can wait until noon. Thomas, I interrupted. My voice didn't rise, but I injected a sudden, iron-hard authority into it that caught him completely off guard. It was the voice that used to silence a rowdy classroom of 30 teenagers in an instant. I've owned this land since before your father bought his first car. I think I've earned the right to take a walk. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. He forced a stiff, awkward nod. Yeah, of course. Sam, you're right. I'm just stressed. Let's ride out there in my truck. Save your knees. No, I said, standing up and reaching for my old denim jacket hanging by the door. The mud is too thick for that heavy Ford of yours. We'll walk. It'll do your heart some good. We left the house in silence. The West Texas sun was rising higher, turning the steaming mud into a pale, glistening landscape. We walked past the barn, past the tractor shed where I had stood in the dark the night before, and headed toward the north pasture. The exact location Thomas had claimed was toxic, dead and worthless. As we approached the wire gate separating the homestead from the pasture, my eyes drifted to the bar ditches running alongside the county dirt road. The heavy rains had washed away the top layer of gravel, exposing the soft, red clay beneath. And there, pressed deep into the mud, were the tracks. They weren't the tread marks of Thomas's Ford F-150, nor were they the wide, turf-friendly tracks of my old John Deere. These were massive, deep cross-hatched impressions left by heavy, multi-axle industrial vehicles. The weight of the trucks had pressed so hard into the wet earth that the clay had squeezed up between the dual tires, creating perfect, hardened ridges. To an untrained eye, they were just muddy ruts. To a geography teacher, they were the unmistakable signature of heavy-duty seismic exploration rigs, the kind of trucks that carry massive hydraulic vibrator plates used to send acoustic waves deep into the earth to map out oil and gas reservoirs. Thomas noticed me looking. He immediately stepped in front of the tracks, trying to casually drag the toe of his expensive ostrich skin boot through the mud to obliterate the tread pattern. Damn poachers. Thomas Leet, his voice sounding tight and hollow in the vast, open quiet of the pasture. Had some teenagers out here four-wheeling a couple of days ago, tearing up what little grass we have left. I swear, people have no respect for private property these days. I watched him kick the mud, his movements frantic, desperate, and utterly pathetic. He was trying to bury the evidence of a multi-million-dollar corporate survey with the toe of his shoe. Poachers, I murmured, looking past him to the horizon, where the distant silhouette of a real estate surveyor's orange flag flickered against a mesquite bush. Yes, Thomas, you're absolutely right. There are some real predators sniffing around this land, but don't you worry. By tomorrow morning, every single one of them is going to get exactly what they deserve. Thomas froze, his boot hovering over the ruined mud. A sudden, cold look of confusion washing over his face as he tried to figure out exactly what I meant. When you spend 4 decades explaining the anatomy of the earth to teenagers, you develop a deep reverence for the tools of the trade. To a modern geologist, data is all digital satellite imagery, computer-generated seismic rendering, and 3D terrain modeling. But to me, geography is a tactile science. It's about the weight of a brass instrument in your hand and the coarse grain of soil between your thumb and forefinger. After Thomas left for the afternoon muttering some half-baked excuse about having to meet a feed salesman in town, I walked down to the basement of my house. Tucked away in a cedar chest beneath a stack of old wool blankets was my grandfather's leather field bag. I pulled it out, blowing a fine layer of gray dust off the cracked leather. Inside lay my old Brunton pocket transit compass, a solid steel soil auger, a magnifying loupe, and a dozen small canvas sample bags tied with twine. Thomas had looked at me with a mixture of amusement and pity when he saw me dragging that heavy bag onto the porch. Going to play scientist. Sam, he had sneered, jingling the keys to his truck. Don't throw your back out digging up rocks. Like I said, that dirt is dead. No sense wasting your energy on it. Just an old man's nostalgia. Tom, I had replied, keeping my voice mild and feeble. Just want to look at the clay layers one last time before we let your Dallas friend take it over. He had laughed. A short, sharp burst of dismissive noise before tearing down the driveway in a cloud of gravel dust. He thought I was harmless. He thought I was just an old horse being put out to pasture, rearranging my old toys. He didn't understand that a man with a purpose is never harmless. I walked out to the north pasture alone, the heavy leather strap of the field bag cutting into my shoulder. The midday Texas sun was brutal, baking the mud from the morning storm into a hard, cracked crust. The landscape looked exactly like Thomas described it. Desolate, barren, and unforgiving. The grass was pale and sickly, struggling to find nutrients in the stubborn caliche clay. But I didn't look at the grass. I looked at the topography. I walked straight toward the area where I had seen the deep, dual-wheel tire tracks earlier that morning. It was a low-lying depression in the north pasture, bordered by a dense thicket of mesquite bushes. I knelt in the dirt, ignoring the sharp pain in my old knees, and began to scan the ground. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. About 50 yards into the brush, the natural contours of the earth had been disturbed. Someone had taken a shovel and frantically tried to blend a specific patch of ground back into the surrounding terrain. They had scattered dead mesquite branches, dry leaves, and loose gravel over a circular area about 6 inches wide. I used my gloved hands to clear away the debris. Beneath the camouflage lay a clean, perfectly circular plug of hardened plastic, a cap used by industrial drilling crews to seal an exploratory core sample borehole. I pulled out my steel soil auger, twisting it deep into the earth, just 6 inches away from the sealed hole. I turned the handle, forcing the metal threads through the stubborn clay, down into the deeper sedimentary layers. When I pulled the auger back up, it brought with it a core sample from about 3 feet down. I scraped a bit of the dark, compacted shale into my palm and brought it up to my nose. It didn't smell like regular Texas topsoil. It didn't have that clean, metallic scent of wet clay. Instead, it carried a faint, sweet, chemical odor, the unmistakable scent of volatile, organic compounds. It smelled like ancient marine life compressed over 300 million years under billions of tons of prehistoric rock. It smelled like natural gas. I pulled out my magnifying loupe and inspected the shale. It was a deep, charcoal black, brittle and heavily fractured. This wasn't dead soil. This was the Barnett Shale Formation. And based on the fracture lines and the pressure release signs in the core sample, the reservoir beneath this square mile of land wasn't just active, it was immense. It was a massive, high-pressure pocket trapped beneath an impermeable cap of limestone. Thomas hadn't lied about the soil on the surface being poor for cattle, but he had deliberately omitted the fact that the dirt beneath our feet was worth a king's ransom. He was trying to buy a treasure chest for the price of the rusty padlock. A profound, heavy silence settled over me as I sat there in the dirt, the black shale still staining my fingers. The last lingering shred of doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp disappointment. Thomas wasn't just a desperate man making bad financial decisions. He was a thief, a calculated predator who looked at my 74 years of life and saw an expiration date he could exploit. He was willing to strip away the diasan of my grandfather, the land where my wife's memory lived, just to line his own pockets with corporate blood money. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just stood up, dusted the caliche clay off my jeans, and carefully packed my tools back into the leather bag. The earth had spoken to me, and it had told me the truth. Now it was my turn to speak back. I walked back toward the main house, but instead of going to my kitchen, I detoured toward the small, wooden foreman's cabin sitting near the old barn. Thomas had been using it as a makeshift office for the past 3 months, keeping it padlocked under the guise of protecting sensitive agricultural records. But Thomas was sloppy. He was the kind of man who thought security meant a bigger lock, forgetting that old buildings have old vulnerabilities. The cabin's side window had a broken latch that I had been meaning to fix since the previous winter. I set my leather field bag down, slid the wooden window frame upward with a gentle, steady pressure, and climbed inside. The cabin smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. The desk was a chaotic mess of empty fast food wrappers, unpaid personal credit card statements, and crumpled betting slips from the horse tracks in Grand Prairie. This was the true face of the man who claimed he was drowning in work to save the Miller Ranch. I began to sift through the papers on the desk, looking for anything related to Vanguard Energy. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinet, and the trash can. Nothing. Frustrated, I leaned against the heavy oak desk, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I noticed a small, leather-bound planner tucked behind a stack of hunting magazines on the bookshelf. I pulled it out. As I flipped through the pages, a folded piece of heavy, high-quality bond paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up and unfolded it. At the top of the page, embossed in a sleek, silver foil, was the logo of Vanguard Energy Corporation, Houston, Texas. It was a formal letter of intent, addressed directly to Thomas Miller's private LLC. My eyes flew down the typed text, scanning the corporate jargon until they hit the specific, terrifying details. Confirming our formal offer for the acquisition of the total subsurface mineral rights for Section 42, Eastland County, the Miller Ranch. Upon verification of the clean transfer of title to Miller Holdings LLC, Vanguard Energy will execute a lump sum payment of $25. Ling 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 ling. Noll Ust. Accompanied by an ongoing 8% production royalty. My breath hitched in my throat as I read the final paragraph at the bottom of the page. Our legal and acquisition team will arrive at the Cisco field office on June 1st at 10:00 a.m. to execute the final contract. Please ensure all property deeds are fully recorded and processed by the county clerk prior to this date. This offer is contingent upon immediate exclusivity, June 1st. I looked at the old calendar hanging on the cabin wall. Today was May 15th. I had exactly 2 weeks. 2 weeks before Vanguard Energy arrived with a $25 million check. 2 weeks before Thomas tried to force my signature on that general warranty deed and disappear into the wind, leaving me with $20,000 and a lifetime of regret. Suddenly, the distant rumble of a truck engine echoed from the highway. Thomas was coming back from town earlier than expected. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly folded the letter, shoved it back into the leather planner, and tucked it behind the magazines. I scrambled across the small room, threw my legs over the open windowsill, and dropped quietly into the grass outside, pulling the window shut just as the white Ford F-150 rounded the corner of the driveway. I grabbed my field bag and walked casually toward my porch, my mind racing faster than it had in decades. The trap was set, the timeline was locked, and the clock was officially ticking. The Blue Star Diner sits just off Interstate 20, a squat, brick building that has survived 3 economic downturns and 4 different owners without ever changing its menu. Inside, the air always smells of burnt chicory coffee, fryer grease, and the faint, sweet tang of industrial floor cleaner. It's the kind of place where the acoustic ceiling tiles are stained yellow from decades of cigarette smoke, and the vinyl booths have been patched so many times with duct tape that they look like topographical maps themselves. I chose a booth in the far back, right beneath a sputtering neon sign that cast a pale, rhythmic buzzing sound into the air. I had arrived 30 minutes early. A good hunter always arrives at the blind before the prey. I spent those 30 minutes practicing my posture. It sounds strange, I know, but camouflage isn't just for soldiers or lizards in the brush. Sometimes, the best camouflage is simply giving a predator exactly what he expects to see. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine until I looked 3 inches shorter than I actually am. I pulled my old denim jacket tight around my chest, shivering slightly despite the mid-morning Texas heat. I placed my reading glasses on the very tip of my nose and let my hands rest on the laminate table, allowing them to mimic a soft, rhythmic tremor. To anyone walking past, I was just another old West Texas retiree, waiting for his liver and onions. A man whose expiration date was rapidly approaching, precisely at 10 o'clock. The diner's heavy glass door swung open, and the little brass bell above it chimed. Thomas walked in. He looked like a man who was vibrating at a different frequency than the rest of the room. He was moving too fast, his eyes scanning the booths with a sharp, restless intensity. He had traded his wrinkled work shirt for a clean, pressed button-down, and those expensive ostrich skin boots of his had been freshly shined. He looked successful, confident, and utterly consumed by greed. When his eyes locked onto me in the back booth, a flash of pure satisfaction crossed his face before he quickly wiped it away, replacing it with a mask of solemn, familial conseil. "Hey, Uncle Sam," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. He brought a wave of expensive cologne and nervous energy with him, disrupting the quiet stillness of my corner. "You look tired. You doing okay? That storm didn't keep you up too late, did it? My bones know when the rain is coming." "Tom," I said, keeping my voice thin, slightly raspy, letting it trail off at the end, as if I lacked the lung capacity to finish the sentence. It was a long night, a very long night. The waitress, an old friend named Clara, who had been working those tables since my kids were in diapers, shuffled over and dropped 2 plastic menus between us. "What can I get you boys?" "Just black coffee for me, Clara," I murmured, giving her a weak, practiced smile. "Make it 2, Thomas said quickly, waving the menus away. He didn't want a distraction. He didn't want to wait for food. He wanted the ink on the paper. As soon as Clara walked away, Thomas leaned across the table, his forearms resting on the laminate. I could see the faint pulse throbbing in his neck. "Sam, I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday. About the land. I know it's hard to let go of a place with so many memories. Trust me, it breaks my heart too. But I stayed up until 2 in the morning looking over the ranch's ledger, and the numbers are terrifying. If we don't file the transfer papers with the county clerk by Monday, the bank is going to freeze our operational accounts. We won't even have the cash to buy diesel for the generator." I looked down at my shaking hands, pretending to fixate on a scratch in the tabletop. "It's just, your grandfather built that original cabin with his own 2 hands. Tom, it feels like I'm betraying him." "You're not betraying anyone." Sam Thomas's voice rose a fraction of an octave, sharp with impatience. Before he caught himself and softened his tone, he reached out and placed his hand over mine, a gesture that made my stomach turn. Knowing what those hands had been holding in the foreman's cabin, "You're saving the family from bankruptcy. That's what you're doing. You're being smart." My investor friend in Dallas. He called me this morning. He said the $20,000 cash offer is only good until noon today. After that, he's putting his capital into a commercial development in Fort Worth. If we miss this window, Sam, we lose everything. The county takes the land anyway for back taxes, and we walk away with 0. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a document, neatly folded into thirds. He unfolded it with a crisp, snapping sound that echoed in the quiet diner. It was the general warranty deed. "I brought the paperwork," Sam Thomas whispered, sliding a heavy, black plastic pen across the table until it rested right against my thumb. "I already filled out the legal descriptions for the acreage. All it needs is your signature right here at the bottom. I've got $20,000 in a cashier's check sitting in my truck right now. The second you sign this, the stress is gone. You're free." I stared at the paper. I could see the legal text clearly through my reading glasses. Grantor conveys. "All right, Tital, and interest in the surface and ground of Section 42. Thomas had drafted it beautifully. To a layman, it looked like a total, absolute surrender of the property. I let out a long, theatrical sigh, the sound of a man who had finally been broken by the weight of the world. I picked up the heavy black pen. My hand shook violently, the plastic tip clicking against the paper. "You promise me you'll take care of the old live oak by the cistern?" "Tom," I asked, looking up at him through the top of my glasses, my eyes watery and wide. "I swear it on my mother's grave," Sam Thomas said, his face deadpan, his eyes locked entirely on the pen in my hand. He was so close to the finish line he could taste it. $25 million was hovering just inches away from his fingers. I lowered the pen to the paper. Slowly, deliberately, I traced the letters of my name across the signature line. Samuel J. Miller. I made the cursive look slightly erratic, the signature of an old man whose grip on life was slipping. The moment the final loop of the R was finished, Thomas practically lunged across the table. His fingers snapped up the document, his eyes scanning my signature with a frantic, unadulterated joy. He folded it back up and shoved it into his pocket, as if he were afraid I might reach out and tear it to pieces. "Thank you, Sam," he breathed, his voice suddenly losing all of that fabricated warmth. He stood up from the booth immediately. Not even waiting for the coffee Clara had just poured into 2 ceramic mugs at the counter. "Listen, I've got to rush this over to the title company in Eastland before they close for the weekend. I'll leave the cashier's check on your kitchen table later tonight." "Okay, Tom." "Wait," I said, my voice suddenly losing its raspy tremor, returning to its natural, résonnant baritone. Thomas stopped, his boots freezing against the linoleum. He turned around slowly, a slight frown creasing his forehead as he noticed the sudden change in my posture. I was sitting up straight now. My shoulders were back. My hands were perfectly still on the table. "What's up, Sam?" he asked, his tone guarded, his hand instinctively pressing against his breast pocket where the deed was hidden. "There's just one minor detail," I said, taking a slow, calm sip of the steaming black coffee Clara had just set down. "A piece of land that large, it carries a lot of bureaucratic weight. My old friend Arthur down in Austin, he's been my estate lawyer for 30 years. I called him this morning before breakfast. I told him I was selling the ranch to you." Thomas's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water, soaking into the caliche clay. You called a lawyer." "Sam, we agreed. We didn't need lawyers. We're family. Lawyers just complicate things." "Oh, don't worry. He didn't complicate a thing," I replied, offering him a cold, untroubled smile. "Arthur just reminded me of a standard Texas procedure. He said that for the deed to be legally binding and processed by the county clerk, it has to be formally notarized and verified through an established estate representative. Since Arthur holds the original family trust documents, he's the only one who can clear the title for recording. I told him you'd be driving the signed deed down to his satellite office in Fort Worth this afternoon to get his official stamp." Thomas stared at me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was trapped. He couldn't record the deed at the courthouse without the title being cleared by the trustee. And if he refused to go to Arthur, the signature he had just fought so hard to get was nothing more than ink on paper. "Fine," Thomas snapped, his jaw clenched tight, his mask of respect completely shattered. "Fort Worth is a 2-hour drive, but I'll do it. I'll see your friend Arthur. Just don't expect me back for dinner." He turned and practically threw himself through the diner's glass door, the brass bell chiming violently behind him. Through the window, I watched his white Ford F-150 peel out of the parking lot, throwing a spray of loose gravel and black exhaust into the hot air as he sped toward the highway. I sat in the quiet booth for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the neon sign. Then I reached into my denim jacket, pulled out my old black flip phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a gravelly, cultured voice answered. "Arthur speaking. He's on his way." "Arthur," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of pity. "He has the signed deed in his pocket. He thinks he just bought the Miller Ranch for $20,000. On the other end of the line, I heard the crisp rustle of legal documents being rearranged on a heavy oak desk, followed by the dry, amused chuckle of a man who loved the law as much as I loved the earth. "Perfect," Arthur said, My secretary has the paperwork ready for his arrival. He'll sign the notary ledger without reading a single word of the addendum. I guarantee it. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Sam, once we file the split, there's no turning back. I looked out the window, watching the vast, empty Texas sky stretch out over the horizon. Beautiful and unyielding. File it. Arthur, I whispered. It's time to show my nephew exactly what happens when you try to steal from the dirt. In the state of Texas, land is never just land. It is a dual kingdom, split by an invisible absolute boundary line that runs right along the surface of the dirt. Most folks who move out here from California or New York buy a piece of property and assume they own everything from the blue sky above to the molten core of the earth below. But Texas law operates on a beautiful, cutthroat doctrine known as the split estate. It means that a single piece of property can be sliced horizontally into two entirely separate legal entities, the surface estate and the mineral estate. The man who owns the surface has the right to build a house, plant crops, graze cattle, and pay the property taxes. But the man who owns the minerals, the oil, the natural gas, the coal buried thousands of feet beneath the grass holds what the law calls the dominant estate. He has the right to explore, drill, and extract that wealth, and there isn't a damn thing the surface owner can do to stop him. It's a legal nuance that has enriched kings and ruined empires, and it was the exact piece of leverage I needed to build Thomas's gallows. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting back on my front porch, the old wicker chair creaking softly beneath me as the heat of the day reached its peak. A lone red-tailed hawk was circling high above the north pasture, riding the thermal currents, searching for field mice in the withered grass. I had my black flip phone resting on my knee, waiting. When it finally vibrated, Arthur's name flashed across the small, pixelated screen. I flipped it open and pressed it to my ear. "Tell me, Arthur," I said, my voice as calm as a Sunday morning. "Sam, I've been practicing law in this state for 45 years. Arthur's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with a mixture of disbelief and dark amusement. "I have seen oil barons cheat their partners, children sue their parents, and corporations strip mine entire counties. But I don't think I have ever seen a man walk into a trap with as much enthusiasm as your nephew just did." I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, measured breath. Did he sign the closing addendum? He didn't just sign it, Sam. He practically tore the pen out of my secretary's hand. Arthur chuckled, the sound of rustling paper audible in the background. He arrived at my Fort Worth office at precisely 1:40. He was sweating through his clothes, pacing the lobby, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He told my receptionist he was in a life-or-death rush to get back to a cattle auction in San Angelo. When I brought him into the conference room, I had the original deed he made you sign sitting on the table, right next to our standard trust verification and title registration packet. Arthur paused, taking a slow sip of what I knew was a glass of neat scotch he kept in his desk drawer for Friday afternoons. I looked him dead in the eye. Arthur continued, and I told him, "Thomas, because your Uncle Sam's property is held within an old family trust structure, this general warranty deed cannot be legally recorded at the Eastland County Courthouse unless you sign this standard title acceptance rider. It simply certifies that you accept the property descriptions as processed by this firm." Do you know what he did? "Sam, he didn't read it." I murmured. "He didn't even flip the page." Arthur said, his tone turning sharp and cold. He saw the words, "Property Conveyance Agreement" at the top, skipped past the 3 paragraphs of single-spaced, 9-point legal text in the middle, and flipped straight to the signature page. He scribbled his name, stamped his thumbprint into the notary ledger, and demanded I give him the sealed deed back, so he could drive it to the courthouse. Before the weekend closure, I looked out across the shimmering, sun-baked dirt of the ranch. And what exactly did those 3 paragraphs say? "Arthur," they stated, "in absolute, ironclad Texas legalese," that the grantee Thomas Miller's LLC was purchasing strictly the surface estate of Section 42, including all existing structures, fences, and topsoil. The second paragraph explicitly stated that the grantor, the Samuel J. Miller Family Trust, was permanently reserving 100% of all subsurface mineral rights, oil and gas interests, and future lease royalties, severing them from the surface estate, effective immediately. By signing that rider, Thomas legally acknowledged that he was buying a square mile of dirt, grass, and rocks. He signed away his rights to the gas reservoir before he even knew he had them. A deep, profound wave of relief washed over my chest, followed by a quiet, steady sense of justice. I hadn't lied to Thomas. I hadn't forged his name. I hadn't broken a single law. I had simply given him exactly what he had spent the last 3 months begging me for. He told me the land was toxic dust. He told me the soil was dead, and the wells were ruined. He had spent weeks trying to convince me that the surface of the Miller Ranch was a worthless, tax-heavy burden. So I let him have it. I gave him exactly what he asked for the exact price he offered, $20,000 for a square mile of barren surface dirt. What happens now, Arthur? I asked. My assistant is digitally filing the severed mineral deed with the state registry in Austin as we speak, Arthur replied, his voice returning to its professional, courtroom gravity. It will be officially recorded in the state database within the hour. Thomas is currently driving down I-20 toward the Eastland County Courthouse to record his surface deed. He thinks he's cementing his ownership of a $25 million jackpot. He has no idea he's actually recording a deed that anchors him to 600 acres of agricultural debt and an impending property tax nightmare. And the corporate meeting, June 1st. Vanguard Energy's acquisition team has a regional field office in Cisco, right down the road from you, Arthur said. Thomas thinks he's walking in there to sign the lease contract as the sole owner. I suggest you let him think that right up until the very last second, but before that happens, we need to introduce ourselves to the corporate suites. After I hung up the phone, I walked back into my house and stood in the quiet of my living room. I looked at the old black and white photograph of my grandfather standing next to his team of mules on this very dirt, his face lined with the brutal exhaustion of a man who had fought the earth for his survival. I looked at the needlepoint sampler. My wife, Martha, had hung by the front door 40 years ago. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. Thomas thought old people were obsolete. He thought that because my joints popped when I stood up, and because I didn't know how to use a smartphone, my mind was as stagnant as the brackish water he lied about. He forgot that the older an animal gets, the more it learns about the terrain. I sat down at my antique mahogany secretary desk. I pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy linen stationery and my favorite fountain pen in a clear, elegant cursive that I had spent 40 years using on high school chalkboards. I drafted a formal, confidential letter. It wasn't addressed to Thomas, and it wasn't addressed to the local field office in Cisco. I addressed it directly to the Senior Vice President of Subsurface Acquisitions at Vanguard Energy Corporation's global headquarters in downtown Houston. Dear Sir, it has come to my attention that your corporate exploration teams have recently finalized a deep-core seismic and geological assessment of Section 42 inches Eastland County, Texas, identifying a substantial natural gas reservoir within the Barnett Shale Formation. I am writing to inform you that as of May 15, 2026, the subsurface mineral rights for the entirety of Section 42 have been legally severed from the surface estate. The sole, absolute owner of those mineral rights is the Samuel J. Miller Family Trust. I understand your acquisition team has scheduled a closing meeting on June 1st with a Mr. Thomas Miller to execute a lease agreement for $25 million. Please be advised that Mr. Thomas Miller owns strictly the surface dirt of the property. He has zero legal authority to lease, sell, or convey the mineral estate beneath it. As the sole trustee of the mineral rights, I will be attending that meeting in person to discuss the terms of the lease directly with your representatives. Enclosed, please find the certified, state-stamped copies of the newly recorded mineral deed. I look forward to a profitable partnership. Sincerely, Samuel J. Miller Trustee, the Miller Family Trust. I folded the letter precisely, slid it into a heavy cardboard mailer along with the certified documents Arthur had couriered to me, and sealed the flap. The next morning, I drove into town and walked into the small Cisco post office. I handed the clerk the package and paid the extra $15 to have it shipped via FedEx next day air, with a mandatory signature required upon delivery, As I watched the clerk slap the bright orange priority tracking sticker onto the envelope, a cold, heavy silence settled over me. The trap was set. The legal machinery was in motion, turning silently, grinding its gears beneath the surface where no one could see it. Thomas had 2 weeks left of living in his magnificent, greedy delusion. 2 weeks of buying expensive whiskey, looking at luxury sports cars online, and treating me like a pathetic old fool who had just handed him the world. I drove back to the ranch, pulled my wicker chair back out onto the porch, and watched the West Texas sun begin its long, slow descent toward the horizon. The countdown to June 1st had officially begun. The regional field office of Vanguard Energy Corporation wasn't located in one of those gleaming glass skyscrapers in Houston or Dallas. Instead, they had set up shop right on Main Street in Cisco, occupying a renovated brick building that used to be a John Deere tractor dealership back in the 1990s. They had plastered tinted film over the expansive showroom windows, installed heavy central air conditioning that hummed like a jet engine, and laid down thick, industrial gray carpeting that still smelled faintly of toxic adhesive. It was a sterile, clinical slice of corporate America, dropped right into the heart of rural West Texas. I arrived at 9:45 on the morning of June 1st. The Texas heat was already pressing down on the asphalt outside, creating a shimmering mirage that made the telephone poles look warped and unstable. I wore my only good charcoal suit, the one I had purchased for my daughter's wedding 20 years ago. It was a little loose around the shoulders now, but it was clean, pressed, and respectable. Arthur was walking beside me, carrying a battered pigskin briefcase that looked older than the United States Constitution. As we approached the glass double doors, I spotted Thomas's white Ford F-150 parked right in the front row, straddling the yellow line as if he already owned the concrete beneath it. We didn't go inside right away. Arthur and I took a seat on a concrete bench across the street, beneath the meager shade of a withered pecan tree. I wanted to give Thomas his moment. I wanted him to settle into his arrogance, to feel the absolute certainty of his triumph before the floorboards gave way beneath his boots. Through the tinted glass across the street, I could see him. He had gone all out. He was wearing a tailored Western-cut suit jacket, a heavy silver belt buckle that practically blinded anyone who looked at it, and a brand-new Stetson hat that had probably cost him a full week of my old teacher's pension. He was pacing the lobby, loudly conversing with a young receptionist who looked desperately like she wished she were anywhere else. He was gesturing wildly, laughing that same hollow, arrogant laugh I had heard through the wooden slats of the tractor shed 2 weeks prior. He looked like a king waiting for his coronation. At precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb. 3 men in immaculate, dark blue Italian suits stepped out. They carried slim, aluminum attaché cases and moved with the stiff, synchronized efficiency of high-stakes corporate mercenaries. These were the senior executives and title attorneys from Vanguard's Houston headquarters. They didn't look at the sky. They didn't look at the town. And they certainly didn't care about the history of the dirt they were walking on. They were here to buy a gas reservoir. Thomas practically threw the glass door open for them, his hand extended. A massive, sycophantic grin plastered across his face. I watched them shake hands, exchange quick pleasantries, and disappear into the large conference room at the back of the building. "All right," Sam Arthur said, checking his heavy gold pocket watch and snapping it shut with a sharp plossingue, metallic click. "The curtain is up. Let's go hand out the grades." We crossed the street, the hot asphalt softening slightly beneath my loafers. When we entered the lobby, the blast of industrial air conditioning hit us like a wall of ice. The receptionist looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of 2 elderly men who looked like they belonged in a historical society meeting rather than a multi-million-dollar corporate closing. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her hand hovering over the desk phone. "We're here for the Miller closing," Arthur said smoothly, not pausing for a second as he walked straight toward the hallway leading to the conference room. "Tell them the landlord has arrived." Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive leather and fresh toner. Thomas was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, surrounded by the 3 Vanguard executives. He had already unrolled a massive survey map of the ranch and had laid a notarized document right in the center of the table. "Gentlemen, as you can see, the title is completely clean." Thomas was saying, his voice booming with an unearned authority as he tapped the paper with his thumb. My LLC took total possession of Section 42 over the weekend. Recorded it at the Eastland Courthouse myself at 8:30 on Friday morning. It's a done deal. You cut the $25 million check to Miller Holdings LLC, and my engineering crews will clear the north pasture for your drilling pads by Monday morning. The lead Vanguard attorney, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Henderson, picked up the deed through a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. He scanned the front page, his expression entirely neutral, the face of a man who looked at thousands of properties a year. But as his eyes flicked down to the legal addendum attached to the back of the document, his eyebrows twitched. He stopped. He read the paragraph again, slower this time, his finger tracing the single-spaced text. He looked up at Thomas, his spectacles slipping down his nose. The warmth completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, dangerous confusion. "Mr. Miller," Henderson said, his voice flat, cutting through the room like a razor blade. "What exactly is this?" "That's the general warranty deed, Mr. Henderson," Thomas said, his grin faltering for a fraction of a second, his voice stuttering slightly. "Signed by my uncle, Samuel Miller, transferring total ownership of the ranch to my company, just like your acquisition team requested." "No, Mr. Miller, it isn't," Henderson replied, tossing the document onto the table with a dismissive slap. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. "This document states that your LLC has purchased strictly the surface estate of Section 42. It explicitly notes that 100% of the subsurface mineral rights, oil and gas interests, and future production royalties have been permanently reserved and severed by the Samuel J. Miller Family Trust." Thomas's face went entirely blank. He blinked once, twice, as if Henderson were speaking a foreign language. I don't think you're reading that right. Sir, I bought the whole ranch, the whole square mile. I gave the old man 20 grand cash for it. We don't care about the surface dirt." "Mr. Miller," another executive snapped, his tone dripping with corporate irritation, "we don't want your grass. We don't want your fences. We are an energy corporation. We came here to buy the gas reservoir in the Barnett Shale. According to this deed, you own absolutely 0% of the minerals beneath that property. You just bought a very expensive pile of dirt." "That's impossible," Thomas roared, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. Standing up so fast, his leather chair flew backward against the wall. "The old man signed it. He didn't say anything about splitting rights. He's 74 years old. He doesn't even know what a mineral split is." "You're lying to me." Right then, Arthur reached out and turned the brass handle of the conference room door. We walked in, our footsteps entirely silent against the thick gray carpet. "Actually, Thomas," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the tense, suffocating air of the room, "I know exactly what a mineral split is. I taught it to your father when he was 16 years old." Thomas spun around, his eyes wild, bloodshot, protruding from his head like a cornered animal. He looked at me, then at Arthur, then at the pigskin briefcase in Arthur's hand. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The realization was hitting him in slow, agonizing waves, stripping away his arrogance piece by piece until nothing was left but raw, naked panic. "Sam," he choked out, his voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whine. "What are you doing here? Why is your lawyer here?" Arthur stepped forward, completely ignoring Thomas, and approached the Vanguard executives. He opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 identical, leather-bound folders, sliding them across the table to the corporate attorneys. "Good morning, gentlemen," Arthur said with a crisp, professional nod. "I am Arthur Pendleton, trustee counsel for the Samuel J. Miller Family Trust. Enclosed, you will find the certified, state-stamped mineral deed for Section 42, recorded in Austin on May 15th. As you can see, my client maintains absolute, dominant ownership of the subsurface estate. We received your letter of intent at our headquarters last week, and we are prepared to execute the lease agreement today with the proper owner." Mr. Henderson grabbed the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with lightning speed. Within 10 seconds, a look of profound relief and corporate satisfaction washed over his face. He looked up at me. a professional smile returning to his lips. "Mr. Miller, it's an honor. Your letter to our Houston office cleared up a very significant misunderstanding. You old bastard," Thomas shrieked, his face turning a terrifying, mottled shade of crimson. He lunged across the table toward me, his expensive Stetson hat falling off his head, rolling into the dirt on the floor. "You set me up. You cheated me. I'm family. You made me sign those papers in Fort Worth. You tricked me." I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded calmly in front of my suit jacket, looking at him with the exact same pity I would show to a broken piece of machinery. "I didn't make you do anything, Thomas," I said softly, my voice filled with a heavy, unyielding weight. "I sat at my kitchen table, and I listened to you tell me the soil was dead. I listened to you tell me the wells were poison. You spent 3 months trying to convince me that the surface of that ranch was a useless, money-losing burden that was going to ruin our family. I believed you, Tom. So I kept the minerals, and I gave you exactly what you asked for. I gave you the dirt. I'll sue you." Thomas screamed, his voice cracking, tears of pure, impotent rage spilling over his eyelids. He was trembling from head to toe, his hands clutching at his chest as if he were having a heart attack. "I'll take everything you have. I'll tell the judge you're senile. I'll get that deed thrown out." Mr. Henderson stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, looking at Thomas with utter disgust. "Mr. Miller," Henderson said to Thomas, "I suggest you sit down and shut up. You signed a notarized title acceptance rider in front of an independent legal witness. You legally acknowledged the severance of the estate. If you try to challenge this in a court of law, our corporation will intervene to protect our leasehold interest, and our legal team will tie you up in litigation until you are bankrupt 10 times over. You have zero leverage here. You're done." Thomas looked around the room, looking at the faces of the 3 corporate executives, then at Arthur, and finally at me. He looked for a single flicker of mercy, a single drop of familial weakness in my eyes. But he found nothing. He had dug his own grave with his own greed, and I had simply handed him the shovel. With a broken shoketsob, Thomas collapsed backward into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving as the absolute finality of his ruin settled over him. Henderson turned away from the broken man and looked at me, pulling a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from his pocket. "Now, Mr. Samuel Miller, shall we discuss the true value of your land?" The ink from a gold-plated fountain pen dries remarkably fast on a multi-million-dollar corporate lease. I sat at that mahogany table for another 45 minutes, carefully reviewing every single line of Vanguard Energy's standard extraction contract alongside Arthur. I wasn't in a rush. I made the high-priced corporate attorneys wait, while I negotiated a crucial, non-negotiable addendum, a strict surface protection and directional drilling clause. I specified that Vanguard could not place a single drilling rig, a single gravel road, or a single diesel storage tank anywhere near the old homestead or the live oak by the cistern. They would have to utilize horizontal drilling technology, boring deep underground from a drilling pad situated 2 miles away on an adjacent property. They agreed to every single word. When a man owns the dominant estate sitting on $25 million worth of natural gas, a multi-billion-dollar corporation will promise him the moon just to get his signature. When I finally pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name as the sole trustee of the Samuel J. Miller Family Trust, Mr. Henderson slid a long, crisp piece of security paper across the table. It was a cashier's check drawn from a major bank in Houston. The number of zeros on that piece of paper looked entirely unreal, a staggering figure that could buy 10 lifetimes of comfort. But my hand didn't shake when I picked it up. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or a burst of wild excitement. I just felt a quiet, heavy sense of finality. The earth had held that treasure for millions of years. It had simply chosen me to be its custodian for a little while longer. Thomas didn't look at the check. He couldn't. He was still slumped in the chair at the far end of the table, his head pressed hard against his palms, staring down at the carpet as if he were waiting for the floor to swallow him whole. His brand-new Stetson hat lay forgotten on the floor by his feet, crushed and covered in gray lint. When the meeting adjourned and the executive stood up to shake my hand, Thomas rose silently, moving with the sluggish, hollow posture of a ghost. He didn't say a word to me. He didn't look back. He just drifted out of the conference room, his boots dragging heavily against the floorboards, leaving the building like a man walking toward a firing squad. But the true beauty of the law and the terrifying nature of human greed is that a trap of your own making always digs a little deeper than you expect. You see, Thomas's ruin wasn't just that he missed out on the $25 million. His true undoing lay in the fact that he had been so absolutely certain of his victory that he had set his own house on fire before he even owned the deed. 2 weeks prior to our meeting in Cisco, while he was still operating under the delusion that he was going to swindle me out of the entire ranch, Thomas had made a fatal bureaucratic move to prove to Vanguard Energy that he was an efficient, forward-thinking businessman. He had filed an expedited application with the Eastland County Commissioner's Court to legally change the zoning designation of Section 42. He had voluntarily stripped the property of its agricultural open space designation, what we Texans call the Ag exemption, and reclassified the entire 640 acres as a commercial industrial energy zone. He wanted the red tape cleared so Vanguard could start drilling the second the ink was dry. In Texas, an Ag exemption is a blessing. It means the county appraises your land based on its capacity to grow crops or raise cattle, keeping your annual property taxes down to a few $100s a year. But once you remove that exemption and reclassify the land as an industrial zone, the county tax assessor smiles. They immediately reappraise the property based on its highest and best commercial market value. On the 1st of October, the annual property tax assessments were mailed out across Eastland County. Because Thomas's LLC was now the official owner of the surface estate, the bill was delivered straight to his rented townhouse in Abilene. Because the land was now zoned for a multi-million-dollar industrial energy project, the county assessor valued the surface area at astronomical commercial rates. Thomas's annual property tax bill didn't just increase, it exploded, skyrocketing by nearly 10,000%. He was hit with a $60,000 tax assessment on a piece of surface dirt that produced absolutely zero income. The irony was devastatingly absolute. Thomas owned the surface. He owned the dead grass, the caliche clay, the brackish water well, and the broken fences. He was legally obligated to pay an industrial-sized tax bill on a property that was entirely useless for agriculture, while I held the subsurface rights, collecting millions of dollars in tax-sheltered mineral royalties without owing a single dime to the county for the dirt above. The dominoes fell with brutal, mechanical speed. The Dallas investor Thomas had lied about the man who was supposedly buying the land for a tax write-off was actually a hard-nosed, hard-money lender. Thomas had borrowed $50,000 from to pay off his gambling debts in Grand Prairie. Thomas had put up his LLC's future assets as collateral, promising the lender a massive payout once the Vanguard deal closed. When the lender found out that Thomas had purchased a worthless surface tract instead of the mineral rights, he didn't wait. He immediately called the loan. Within 30 days, the bank froze Thomas's corporate accounts. A week later, a flatbed tow truck pulled into his driveway and repossessed his white Ford F-150. By the time November rolled around, Thomas was completely wiped out. He was buried under $60,000 of county tax debt, a $50,000 personal default judgment, and a mountain of credit card bills he had run up while celebrating his imaginary wealth. He couldn't afford a lawyer to fight the state, and he couldn't face the people of Cisco after his disgrace became public knowledge in the local courthouse records. On a freezing, rain-slicked night in mid-November, Thomas packed whatever clothes he had left into 2 cardboard boxes, abandoned his rented townhouse, and left the county in a battered, used sedan he had bought for $500 cash. The last I heard, he was working a night shift at an oilfield equipment yard outside of Odessa, living in a cramped, rusted trailer house, earning just enough to keep the collection agencies from banging on his door. He had wanted to escape the dust bowl of Cisco with millions in his pocket. Instead, he had ended up in the harsh, desolate plains of the Permian Basin, choking on the exhaust of the very industry he had tried to exploit. As for me, the quiet rhythm of my life returned to the Miller Ranch. Though the world around me changed in wonderful, subtle ways. I didn't buy a luxury condo in Austin, and I didn't buy a fleet of sports cars. I kept my old John Deere tractor, and I still spend my mornings tending to the jalapeno plants in the garden behind my house. but I used that corporate wealth to anchor the community that had given me a purpose for 40 years. I established the Martha Miller Geography and Earth Sciences Scholarship Trust, an endowment that fully funds the college tuition for 3 underprivileged students from Cisco High School every single year. I hired a local crew of carpenters to completely restore the historic timber roof of the town's community church, and I quietly paid off the medical debts of 4 retired teachers I used to work with who were struggling to survive on their meager state pensions. Every evening, as the West Texas sun begins its slow, majestic descent below the horizon, I walk out to the north pasture. The air is peaceful. Thanks to the directional drilling clause, there isn't a single piece of heavy machinery disrupting the landscape 2 miles away, hidden behind a ridge. The invisible, silent machinery of Vanguard Energy is drawing the natural gas out from 4,000 feet beneath the surface, turning ancient history into modern power. But up here, on top of the world, the grass still sways in the evening breeze. The old live oak tree stands tall and resilient by the cistern, its roots reaching deep into the earth, holding fast to the soil that has sustained my family for over a century. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the caliche clay, it feels like the land itself is breathing a sigh of relief. It's a reminder that a man's life isn't measured by the wealth he tries to steal from the world, but by the integrity with which he walks upon it. The greedy look at the dirt and see nothing but an opportunity to take. The wise look down and realize that the earth always remembers who loved it and who tried to betray it. And in the end, the dirt always wins. Thank you for listening to my story. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep your feet firmly planted on solid ground.